Hey guys, I hope you're having a great day. Today I wanted to talk about the game Dungeon Warfare 2. Like in past videos, I'm going to give my early impression of the game and talk a bit about some of the positives and negatives. But first, what is Dungeon Warfare 2? As the name suggests, it's the sequel to the positively received Dungeon Warfare, but it's also the second game released on Steam by the developer Vulsar. Although I have not played the original Dungeon Warfare, from what I could gather, the sequel doesn't really stray too far from its predecessor, choosing to make smaller additions, but that's to be expected from an indie game of this size and scope. Like with most tower defense games, your goal is to defend a point on the map by setting barriers and a variety of towers, or in this case traps, along a pathway that the enemies will follow along in order to stop their progression. In this game, completing levels and defeating enemies will earn you items that you can equip for a variety of stat boosts, runes that will allow you to mod the difficulty of a stage in exchange for more experience, gems used for enhancing your traps, and skill points used to fill out a skill tree consisting of 3 different categories. I found there to be a surprising amount of depth in planning out how I wanted to spend my skill points, and I was quite happy to find that the game allows you to add and remove points as you please. The same goes for spending and reclaiming gems on trap upgrades. I found myself spending a lot of time trying to plan out my trap loadout, skill set, and equipment in a way that I'd get the most bang for my buck, often changing something between every single game, though I should mention that unless you're using a lot of runes to mod the difficulty heavily, then this shouldn't be all that necessary. This is, however, where I find my first nitpick. Some of the menus don't have the best design, and I can't say I'm particularly fond of how some UI elements are handled. I can see some new players finding it confusing, and I've accidentally closed tutorial windows while I was playing, leading me to doing a little bit of guesswork. It's not too bad really, but I think the game's UI is probably its weakest element. Before I move on to the next subject of this impression, I did want to mention that the game has you identifying new items and runes. This is fine and all, but I personally feel as though having this done manually is kind of unnecessary. It just feels like a system that has no purpose. There is pretty much no reason you wouldn't want something identified, as far as I can tell, but the game just wants you to do it for every item you earn. Now on to the meat and potatoes of the game. That is to say, the gameplay itself. What we're looking at is pretty standard for a tower defense game. If you've played others in the past, then nothing here should surprise you. That being said, Dungeon Warfare 2 puts a lot of emphasis on traps that affect enemy movement. You have push traps that move enemies away from a wall, harpoon traps that pull an enemy towards them, and plenty of others that affect the enemy's movements in much more interesting ways. In many cases, rather than whittling the enemy's health down, it's better to set up traps that will drive them off cliffs, leading to an instant death. Maps will sometimes include hazards like moving walls and rolling minecarts that you can corral enemies into or around to either take damage, slow down, or even kill instantly right then and there. There are little bits and bobs on each stage, such as destructible floors and objects on the map that give bonuses if either destroyed or protected. Altogether, I found that Dungeon Warfare offered a medium to high challenge that you yourself can manipulate with the rune system. Some maps require a lot of strategy to beat, but I did get to a point where some tasks felt as though they could not be completed unless I upgraded a few more traps, skills, or found better equipment. It just wasn't going to happen. So expect there to be at least some grind. I feel like this game does a good job at showing how something simple doesn't mean it can't have depth. Many tower defense games feel as though they are too simple or unfairly difficult, but I think Dungeon Warfare 2 hits the mark. Next up, let's talk about sound design and the game's art style. The game goes for an older retro art style and keeps the music and sound simple. If you don't like pixels or MIDI style music, this is going to look and sound really ugly to you. But if you're cool with a game that looks like it would fit nicely on the Super Nintendo, then you're probably gonna have a good time. I don't think I need to say this, but the option menu is pretty limiting, but I don't think that's something anyone will really need to worry about. One nitpick I found personally was the game doesn't do borderless full screen, so alt-tabbing is kind of a nuisance. The maps on offer are fairly plentiful, and there also seems to be some that are randomly generated, but if you get tired of those, then there are options for creating and downloading new ones, so your mileage can go on until you've had enough. This is the type of game that will eventually get repetitive, but it's a small indie title, and it's priced at $17.50 Canadian, easily worth the price of entry if you ask me. In conclusion, Dungeon Warfare 2 is a fantastic game that I honestly feel stands out, but doesn't stand out too much, hitting all the marks necessary to satisfy any fan of the tower defense genre. But I want to know what you think. Will you be picking up Dungeon Warfare 2? Let me know in the comments, and consider subscribing if you're interested in seeing more. I would like to thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon. Goodbye!